Thank you all for being here. Thanks to Alexandra and the Myrtos and Hakan and so many others involved in organizing this event. I'll also just briefly thank the AV team and the caterers and the janitors that are coming in at night, the less visible labor that's holding us together. Yeah, okay. Oops, this is what I need. Okay, that's starting to move. Right, so very happy to be here today. I'm going to talk about, invite us to think together about the way we live inside, right? Where you spend a lot of our life inside buildings, the systems and the machines, the habits and practices that we depend on for comfort and health, and how the costs of those systems, especially those mechanical ones, are both immense and seemingly unavoidable, and even more intensely displaced and often invisible. We have the fortunate opportunity today that this building itself, this amazing space that we're in, this stunning room that we've been sitting in the past 2 days, was going to make a lot of my points for me. And before we continue on to some of these, I'll get back to some of these later. Oops. There we go. I want a blank screen. I want to invite you all to just take a second and feel about where you are. This is with a bow, if you'll forgive me, to Gina from last night. To see yourselves in this room, right? Look around the extensive, albeit careful and delicate ways that this space has been transformed over the decades, over the centuries, right? The rich texture of the stone walls, it's fun to touch, but don't get it on your clothes. The relatively new ceiling we see, using traditional systems, but supported by these steel beams in various places, a modernized customary technique. Thick cement columns that I assume are either replacing a previous stone masonry column or else brand newly inserted to keep us well protected, keep us all safe from anything falling down. And we can also see, and we'll focus for a second, in the pediments, right? These ventilation windows, if you can see them a couple of times in this space. Now, this is not a temple exactly, right? I mean, maybe it is for these few days. But if it were, the center of the pediment, of course, is where the message from the gods would be delivered, right? So this is the focal point, or one of them. And so I want to give us the opportunity, take the chance here today, to honor, or dare I say already, enchant the air that is blowing around in this room, right? The air that is allowing us to breathe and feel comfortable, hopefully healthy, as we experience this space. The height of these vents suggests that they are taking some advantage of the so-called chimney effect, right? Drawing hotter air out, inducing airflow from the doors and other openings, keeping us alert. Of course, much more today than yesterday. I don't know, some of you, I've been mesmerized by the blowing curtains as well as the day has gone by. Okay, you guys are already doing it. I was just going to ask you to be quiet for a second, but everybody was already being quiet. So let's do it one more time, just a little bit of silence. Okay, there you can hear it, right? We also have the air conditioning, right? These portable units spread in throughout the space, plugged into the mains, drawing power from the grid, churning away, working hard to allow us to be relatively comfortable. The air is breathable. Presumably there's a filter inside. Hopefully it has recently been changed or cleaned, so they also keep us healthy, right? Allowing us again to be in here in our suits and our everyday clothes on what is, to me at least, a surprisingly hot September Friday. So if you're too hot right now, you can move closer to these portable units. I'll note they were much lower yesterday, so whoever's in charge is doing a good job at keeping us just at the right level. You can move closer to these units. You could also close your computer, turn off your phone, stay away from the AV booth, no offense, right? But all of these devices, along with their beneficial services, are aggressively generating heat, right? It's not only our bodies in this space, but all of our devices, which are setting the thermal conditions in which we're existing. Some of them have fans spinning, they're warming up the room, they're helping us to require the AC. So feel free to power down, feel free to take off your jacket, right, make yourself comfortable. Now, if you're too cold, and I'm a bit surprised, but hey, everybody has a different thermal regulation system in their body, right? There is no universal comfort zone, despite which the air conditioning engineers would like us to believe. We all respond to thermal conditions quite differently. But if you're too cold, you can go outside and stand in front of the other side of the air conditioning unit, right? The waste heat system, which is to emphasize that air conditioning AC doesn't exactly cool the air, right? It just moves the heat somewhere else. And in this case, I just snapped this yesterday. It moves them directly outside. That's just on the other side of this wall. Moves them to these units outside to indeed exhaust the waste heat. So connecting back to an earlier panel, a different sort of waste. So this aircon that's not cooling the air is using a lot of energy, an inordinate amount of energy, too often fossil fuel energy, to move the heat elsewhere, again, to spaces where we don't really see it, right? And we'll sort of expand that out for a minute in just a second. Use of mechanical cooling has been increasing as our planet warms and the climate becomes less stable. According to the International Energy Agency, the IEA, cooling demand, and that's an important term here, right? Cooling demand. Like, are you out there demanding it, right? Or is it sort of cooling desire, cooling aspiration? Cooling demand will increase by 1,400%, right? 1400, 1,400% by 2100. So maybe another pause for silence, right? To sort of take that in. Much of this is seen to be managed, as we see here, in this sort of green, light blue dashed area. Much of that is seen to be managed through innovations in efficiency. We can kind of cycle back to Ruth's comments about efficiency not necessarily being the goal. I'm a bit more interested in this thin pink band, right, that in fact stays relatively stable despite everything else changing. On the top, behavioral change, right, what thermal comfort scientists like to refer to as adaptive opportunities. What I'm going to call today re-enchanting our relationship with the built environment. Reimagining, that is, how we live in buildings, how we live with buildings, how we can take seriously this relationship to the built environment relative to carbon emission and its consequences, and see this relationship as one of the most important relationships we will have in our lives, individually and collectively, relative to the conditions of the future. So how can we sort of reimagine, deepen this relationship to our buildings? So how do we, again, re-enchant our thermal experience, our sense of comfort in indoor environments, such that we stop extracting, quite literally, such a cost on the outside? I'm going to skip this, I think, for now. So I'm going to go through a few projects, just kind of think through a few projects that I've been working on the last couple of years, collective projects around some of these questions, all of them rooted, at least from my side of the collaborations, from this essential quote from Richard Neutra, an architect, a Viennese, Los Angelesian architect from the 1940s into the 60s. As he writes, there has, of course, always been comfort in the world, reckless comfort, we could say, comfort based on someone else's continuous labor. So a sort of version of that sort of primary environmentalist principle, there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? So I want to talk through a few projects. The first one, as referenced previously, a project that I did in collaboration with many others. You can see the list here at the Venice Biennale, still open if you're interested in going. It closes, I think, November 26th or so. We were given, if any of you, has anybody seen it? I know a few of you may have, but maybe a few. Okay, that's good. I can say whatever I want, right? Just gives you a little bit of a sense of what we're talking about. The Venice Biennale, of course, a biannual event that's celebrating the sort of innovations and systems in architecture up and coming, right? The kind of latest edge of architectural thinking. We'll come back to some of these videos in a second. This is also us, right? We are also heat engines, right? We are also heat generators. But I'm showing you this just to give you a sense of what we were up to in this project. This is the Arsenale building, one of the centerpieces of the Biennale, be it art or dance or architecture. In the case of this Biennale, opened in May, a very long array of projects, a sort of heterogeneous mix of projects from all over the place, lots of different ideas, lots of robots at play. I've actually recently heard that some of the robots have tried to stab themselves with their pens and have broken down, but we'll leave that to another talk. But nonetheless, we're at the beginning, number one over there, of this huge passageway, a kind of very long hallway. This is actually looking from the outside, but just to give you a sense of that distance, right? So we were asked to sort of program the entry room to give a sense of what's at stake, right? As we imagine these architectural possibilities that we're going to explore in the rest of the rooms, right? What are we sort of facing as we go in there? So we titled our project Terms and Conditions, right? Every time you get your new app, right, that's going to help us save the world in various ways, you have to click on, you agree to the terms and conditions. Does anybody read those terms and conditions? Okay, good for you. I don't read them at all, but I have a friend who makes a study of it and compares them and critiques them, et cetera. Good thing to do. In any event, we were trying to set up a question of these are the terms and conditions that you will experience before you can sort of go forward into this condition. So another video that I'll talk over for a minute. It's the first room again of the Arsenale. This is the sort of entry room. We're about to get in, and we're going to be seeing some of these cooling units. And the trick here is I was just sort of making this inside-outside play with the photograph of the outside. Here you see, watch out, it's a high-temperature room. The trick that we sort of played in this installation is that, in fact, you're walking into this room, seeing all these air conditioners, maybe anticipating a cold space, but in fact, it's the waste heat side of those air conditioners, right? So you're walking into an incredibly uncomfortable room, in which you're, again, getting the heat, the humidity. There's these water pools that are actually making it smell a little damp and dank. An uncomfortable experience, right? But one that is felt by millions around the world every day. We see all of these cooling units that are required, that require the planetary infrastructure that feeds them, right? The mains that are piped in, a way of building and living in buildings that continues to combust and emit, further locking in carbon and accelerating the rise in temperature and humidity. This kind of vicious cycle is what we're trying to model here, right? Cooling systems turning away and heating things up, requiring more cooling, a familiar background hum for many of us, and you can still hear it. Yeah, the volume's not too high, but in the room itself, it's quite cacophonous, let's say. A background hum that, frankly, many of us, and I include myself here, right, are accustomed to kind of tuning out, right? It seems like it's there, it's necessary, we give into it, right? But this ante-room, right, this kind of entry space, again, brings that outside in. The outside side of the air conditioners is inside, the units blowing waste heat, so that the rest of the space can be cool. Heat is displaced from there to here, from them to you, a sort of spatial allegory for the global inequities of the thermal interior. Who gets to be comfortable, for how long, and at what cost? So we just entered out of the exhibition space, and here you see the cooling units, right? So it's kind of like if you've been in Manhattan in the middle of the summer and the Gap stores all have their doors open as you walk by on Madison Avenue and feel the cool air, and they're like, oh, maybe I'll go buy a t-shirt or a pair of socks or something, right? It's the kind of opposite of that. You go through the hot, damp thing, and then as you open up that last portal, that kind of wave of cool air comes down onto you. So indeed, in one side, it's cool, it's consistent, it's comfortable. It's normed and universalized, sealed and contained, always on, always available, always more or less the same temperature. On the inside, in this case, again, what is normally the outside, hot, noisy, and damp, unpredictable and uncomfortable, porous and precarious, a space of thermal contestation where luxury and survival emissions are debated, where hospitals and cooling centers stake claim to socio-thermal investments, where public health is negotiated by minimizing risk and accepting loss. So the point is that this is the thermal inequity. That the lifestyles of the comfortable, and again, such as myself, such as ourselves in many cases, the lifestyles of the comfortable exacerbate, too often unthinkingly, supported by building systems that are no longer fit to purpose. It's to point out that we are all at the edge, temporally and geographically displaced, right? But only for now. Displaced from a world overwhelmed by non-compensable heat, by sweaty nights, by thermal stress that we cannot come back from. Okay, 2 more quick projects as we move along, and I'll talk about them a bit more generally in order to save some time. For the International Architectural Biennale Rotterdam in 2023, again, a biennial event showcasing some of the latest thinking in the field, this time called The Nature of Hope, curated by Jana Bikströth and a great team. We were asked to, as a group that had been working with this question of comfort and how we live after comfort, we were asked to make an intervention. Our first proposal was that they would turn off the air conditioning units for the duration of the show, right? And let people be hot. And that was not okay. And then we thought, okay, turn them off if it goes above, say, 35 degrees. We just stop it, wait until it goes back down. So maybe you get to open the museum back up at, night at night or 11 at night and have a nice time playing around in the middle of the night. That didn't go so well either, in part because, indeed, the building itself, this is the Noy Institute in Rotterdam. Some of you may be familiar with it. The building itself is not only the exhibition space, which we see here in the bottom, this brick volume. It's also, sorry. It's also this sort of mini glass tower in the back, right? And then behind the two of these, this is a split screen sort of view, this immense archives that holds the National Architecture Archives of the Netherlands, right? So not something to toy with, right? We wanted to make sure this was taken care of. So the notion of turning down the air conditioning was very frightful. And we initially thought we might just publish the 7,500 emails that we went back and forth with, trying to see if we could get in there and turn off the air conditioning. But in the end, we discovered in this process that they were about to change their cooling system, right? They were about to put in a new heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system in their mechanical hall. I'm just showing here a very early sketch from the architect where you see that archive bar at the back, that little 3-story tower, and then the exhibition space. So we learned that they were changing their air conditioning. So we decided to make a film, sort of a documentary or a set of discussions around the experience of the building. And I'm not going to show the whole thing. I'll show you later. Sorry, you could turn this down a little bit because we don't need to hear all the voices right now. Thanks. The idea here was less about proving some thesis or even kind of having a specific experience given the media at hand, but more about understanding the habits and practices of the individuals that use these spaces. We're seeing here the operations director, the manager of the janitorial staff and the kitchen staff, their offices being in the basement of that connects the buildings, in fact, and a lot of discussion about how the basement became the space where even the director, who is, his office is on the 3rd floor of the tower, of course, would come down and do his work in the basement break room because that's the coolest part of the building, coolest part of the complex in the summer. Trying to understand in some detail, albeit without a lot of sort of precise data, how people lived and experienced this space thermally. Right? And what were their desires, what were their aspirations for transformation, so not only they could live comfortably, indeed in these archival spaces where it's quite delicate, or in other spaces where it's a bit more complicated, so that they could live comfortably without exacerbating the conditions outside. Right? Which is a sense, if I can, again, play with this term of re-enchanting comfort. If I'm comfortable in an air-conditioned space, yet I'm making others uncomfortable, maybe we can sort of expand that space of comfort, right, to include some of these others and reimagine our practices. Some really interesting things, I should say, going on in the archival space. Drawings and models such as are stored here don't actually need to be especially cool. The humidity question is a little more complicated. There just needs to be a constant temperature, right? And that could be 22 degrees rather than 17 in many cases, right? So there's a question of a lot of energy savings available in this context. So again, I'm not going to go through this film in great detail. It's about 22 minutes long. But the ambition here is to really understand how our habits and practices shape the world inside, and then, of course, by a very simple elaboration, shape the world outside as well. Just to jump into a few other aspects for a quick second, a group that I've been working with around this question of after comfort has been working an ongoing series on the eFlux architecture platform, an online web platform. You can see here, and sort of annoyingly scrolling through this with this screen grab, we've now published, I think, about 30 essays, about the same amount to come. Poets, architects, artists, scholars, scientists, all sorts of, much like the gathering here, a very polyvocal group of individuals thinking about how we can live differently in the interior, thinking about how we can reimagine our relationship to space. Also quite involved at this stage, and this goes right back to this question of efficiency is not the goal, with the question of sufficiency, right? Rather than using the energy more efficiently, just use less, reduce absolute demand. And so Yamina Saheb, a sociologist trained as a landscape architect, I should note, who's been working a lot with the IPCC, has developed this World Sufficiency Lab as a means to bring together some of these discussions and, of course, try to get them into policy. And lastly, this isn't actually lastly, but lastly for this part, another group that has been working on reimagining the way that we make buildings, right? Really looking at buildings such as this as opportunities for reuse and renovation, right? These are two of the real buzzwords in the architecture community right now, how to reuse what's already there. The 2021, I think, winners of the Pritzker Prize, right, the sort of Oscars of architecture, Lacaton and Vassal, a French firm who have long championed their catchphrase, never demolish, right? It's never a good idea to take a building down. It's always a good idea to reimagine it, right? And they've done so with great effect. So a couple of issues on the table, right? A couple of ways of really thinking about how we understand the way that we relate to buildings, how we can start to reimagine that relationship at the level of design, at the level of practice. I like to use this phrase thermal practice as a means to think about not only how a designer could potentially intervene in a space like this, amplifying the ventilation as we see here as a means to make it a bit more comfortable, but also how we can sort of change our practices. This is where I take off my jacket, right? And say, oh, okay, yeah, that feels a little better. I can do something too. I don't have to rely on the building to save me. Technology is not going to save us, right? Not that it's not an important part of our story, but we have to save ourselves. That inner transformation of cultivating different aspirations for how we live inside is what I'm really trying to put on the table. So one last project very quickly, a project I've been doing in collaboration with the Martel Foundation in Cognac, where they make the cognac, right? Unfortunately, I don't drink, so the visits are always a little dour. But nonetheless, a great project I've been doing with the foundation there. This is the building that was turned into the foundation, the art foundation that they've developed about a decade ago. Initially a bottling plant, right? So they needed that height. It's quite high for a rural French building, right? In order to allow the gravity to bring all the eau de vie together in the bottling process of the cognac. Renovated in 2016 by a Bordeaux firm, beautifully done, of course, and this is, I'm not pointing fingers, right? Renovation and retrofit is a very complicated process from the architectural perspective, from the client perspective, from the labor perspective, the building industry perspective, et cetera. So asked to do a residency there, this is the beautiful entryway into the space. Asked to do a residency there, I got really interested in the fact that while I was there, they were in the process of replacing all of their windows, right? Because something had gone wrong with the weight of the windows and the type of caulk that they had been using. Again, I would say a simple mistake, maybe, but obviously somebody should have figured it out, not saying who. But nonetheless, the entire set of windows had to be replaced, right? So it helped me to think about how, again, we're living with buildings, that buildings themselves are in many sense a kind of living species, right? They themselves have good days and bad days, right? Sometimes they leak, sometimes they feel kind of toxic, sometimes they want to open the window and feel the air, sometimes they want to keep it closed. So I've been taking these time-lapse photos, 1 per minute for 24 hours, to think in particular about how buildings dream. And I'll read again for 1 second and then be done. What do buildings do in the nighttime when no one is looking? Buildings are themselves more than human species, living biomes breathing and being in common with humans and other species on this terrified planet. The species being of the building is defined by its thermal condition, in part, its breath enveloping inhabitants within a conditioned space, a little pocket of comfort, right? It's also defined by its aggregate condition, all of these discrete little spaces all over the world, concentrated unevenly, adding up to a sort of planetary conditioning, right? A planetary interior desperate for intervention. Buildings are alive, not only breathing, but also precarious, tentative material systems, hanging on for dear life, if on a non-human timescale. They have good days and bad days, as I said. A window seal compromised, we'll see the window seal in a second. Excess humidity in the basement, molds and toxicities. I'm sure all of us have had some problem at some point in time with our house or our apartment, right? Something that was kind of growing that we didn't recognize. Our bodies and minds are in constant dynamic relationship with buildings, their systems, their materials, their spaces, their age and aging, their mysteries, their wondering. With renovations and retrofits, policy interventions, and circular economies, we're aiming to operate collectively to minimize their energy demand. To see, in other words, buildings as our friends. And this is the air-leaked window there. You see that sort of creamy window on the right that I've become a little obsessed with. So let's say buildings are our friends, our partners and collaborators in organizing a life indoors after efficiency, after fossil fuels. The end of energy demand itself demands engagement with existing buildings as the space for decarbonizing interventions. We can see buildings then as collaborative agents, supporting our ambitions, or at least aspiring to. Buildings amaze us, alarm us, fail and scare us. We want something new from them in the current age, a different future. We want our buildings to have different dreams. But what could they possibly dream of? Passive interventions, again, our ventilation system that lighten the load, emptied out mechanical HVAC rooms. We kind of imagine the ghost that might remain after that system is removed. Fantasies of inhabitants in choreographed practice, a dance of collaboration with the thermal dynamics of the planetary interior. If we could live together better with buildings, more fruitfully, how would buildings be different? So I'll invite you to consider in your homes and offices, in your hotel rooms tonight, perhaps even in this space, and as we march through these amazing spaces of this building, how do buildings dream and what do they aspire to? Thanks for your time.
Okay.
Yeah, happy to take it.
Okay, this is open. Thank you very much. Before I hand over to the audience, I have a question for you.
Please.
You are also a professor of history of architecture, and there's been a lot that has been learned and done over centuries. And I remember many years ago seeing buildings in India where using water and using openings like this and from underneath.
Yeah.
I remember sitting in this huge building in the center of India where it was like there was air conditioning.
Yeah.
I mean, how were those guys doing it?
Yeah.
I mean, this is obviously ancestral intelligence, but can't we learn from that?
Yeah, and absolutely. And I think as a historian, I've retitled my chair of architecture history the chair of architectural history and decarbonization, right? And really the question I'm asking with my colleagues and students, how can history support the sort of broader imperative to decarbonize our built environment? And you've hit on one of the main ways, which is expanding that historical scope, right? Understanding the complex geopolitical dynamics and, let's say, aspiring for non-extractive dynamics of looking at customary practices. And I use the term customary very intentionally, right? Not traditional practices or vernacular practices, because those imply, although they don't quite define, that it's in the past somehow, right? But as you're suggesting, many of these practices are continuous, right? All the way up to today. One of the sort of terrors we face in the culture of architecture, and I'll just say I am myself a graduate of the Columbia Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, right? And as with many schools, that school faces this challenge. Modernism came on the scene and had the explicit goal of delegitimating customary practice, right? The old is the old, the new is the new, the shock of the new, let's go forward, progress, et cetera, et cetera. So we now struggle culturally, and I should say not technologically. The information is clear, it's there, the data is available. But as a field of architecture, struggle culturally to shirk that sort of, I don't know, the ghost of modernism, the specter of modernism that haunts us, even though our buildings are doing very different things, and we're asking very different things of our buildings today. So a lot of what I'm asking with my colleagues and students, how can we look back to some of those practices, the Persian wind scoops in particular, that draw air from a deep basement through a chimney effect out to the roof, and of course cool all of the spaces in between, right? And many others, and just thick walls as we see here, right? I mean, there's so much, as you say, ancestral intelligence embedded in our buildings, and understanding the precise methodological practices, right, as a historian, that we can work with that intelligence and understand how it can be applied or investigated or reimagined, modernized perhaps, to use the word more generally, technologized, let's say, in the present.
Thank you. So let me look around and see. I see a question over there. Is there a mic, Eleftheria? Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this is a fascinating field. And I come from Greece, that of course we care a lot about history and archaeology. But I also work at a public hospital, which is an awful building, and I don't think even that it's a safe building. And I was wondering how we can convince those that they are the decision makers to really invest in that not only for the safety first, of course, but then also for the well-being and the mental health and first for the patients and then for the caregivers and the health professional.
Yeah, absolutely.
What can we say?
Yeah, I would say a few things. I mean, I think on the one hand, I think there's a question of sort of trying to assemble a better understanding of what we still call our carbon account, right? Even though, I mean, it should be negative, right? But of course, we're still using a lot of carbon. But how do we concentrate that carbon, right? How do we not concentrate it in the sense of focusing it on where it's needed most? Hospitals, schools, archives and museums, arguably in specific spaces, spaces that are essential for health and well-being, right? So when I'm talking more generally about this question of moving past a reliance on comfort, on mechanical comfort, in our daily lives, in spaces such as this, maybe in your house, depending on how it's designed, right? But not in a place like a hospital where it's desperately needed. But the second thing I would say is that, the question of sort of working, there's a great group, another European Citizens Initiative, I don't know if Teo's still here, relative to the one we saw yesterday, called House Europe, right, which is arguing for, again, this sort of resistance to demolition, right, this resistance to thinking that we have to build new. So giving policymakers, decision makers, some ammunition to start talking about the importance of reuse, right? So how can we approach the building that you have that, sounds like it's in pretty bad shape, but might have, say, good structural bones, or might have some parts of it that still work. I don't know, I don't want to make any assumptions. How can we develop an architectural intelligence, and this is really mostly what we're teaching in schools these days, to enter into those spaces and reimagine them with biomaterials, thinking about wall thickness, thinking about passive ventilation. In the case of hospitals, probably relying on some mechanical systems for those spaces that require very specific temperature and humidity. But these are the these are the skills of the architect of, I was going to say of tomorrow, but really of today, right? I mean, this is what we train in our studio courses right now, yeah? So I think encouraging, as that wave sort of begins to crest a bit more, I think we'll get a lot more take up from policy aspects in other areas. Again, the World Sufficiency Lab is another place that's making those pushes. There's a lot of kind of NGO and broader architectural councils and policy directives really pushing for this question of reuse, right, and developing the skills that are necessary. Very challenging, again, to the architecture culture in some ways.
Thank you very much for your intervention. I think it brings together many of the things that have been discussed, at least here today. If I may try to make a link to the morning session about the economy, I think part of how the architecture has been evolving has to do with an abundance of resources, either free resources that we did not price in the externalities, and coming back to the notion of carbon credits that we discussed this morning, or a low-cost resource. I think that's part of how we saw, for example, the factories evolving over time from great flat areas where you could have natural light and natural ventilation to areas where they were technically and artificially lighted,
sealed up,
or of course, or air-conditioned. So how do you see current practices and research on architecture informing that discussion, and maybe in a holistic level? Because I think architecture has the benefit of having a holistic overview over societies and cities and how we live in there.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. And certainly, the question of, the last century has, we've seen many different types of buildings, but many that we know, or many that are celebrated in the profession, right, are built from concrete, glass, and steel. Hard to imagine more carbon-heavy materials. One could, but nonetheless, it's quite up there. And of course, sealed such that they require constant HVAC systems, constant mechanical systems. If I can suggest that some of you might be familiar with the Seagram's Tower in Manhattan, right? And not pretending I'm amongst architectural. Anybody? Yeah, Midtown Manhattan, the Seagram's Tower? Okay, one or two. Okay, thank you. I feel a little better. We need some public education of architectural history. Although probably not this bit, right? Because the Seagram's Tower, designed by Mies van der Rohe, a celebrated modernist icon, repeated, in fact, in many cities and around the world as a sort of symbol of modernity, is one of the worst performing buildings imaginable, right? It was rated on a scale of 0 to 100. It was rated a 3 in 2009, and it's only gotten worse, right? I won't get into the jokes about the United Nations and their maintenance issues, given the sort of recent events there. At the same time, right, that's the kind of dark past, if you will, right? But there's beginning to be a recognition that we're in a different era, right? The buildings that we have produced are not fit to purpose. And we need to think about how we can reimagine not only our building stock that exists and how to intervene in it, but quite precisely, what are we training architects to do, right? We're no longer so interested in building jewel boxes of fancy museums that will shine for a few years and then begin to fall apart and require extra maintenance and lots of fossil fuels, but rather how we intervene in existing spaces, right? And we're framing the project of architecture less, again, as the sort of computational possibilities of fantastic design, right? And more about how we can be agents of decarbonization. So I think kind of 5, 10, 20 years from now, as we imagine an architect, it won't be the sort of, figure of the brilliant mind kind of form coming out of their head, right? It will be the collective, the community that's able to reimagine a space or a city or a district to decarbonize that space through materials, through insulation, through shifting out different glass panels and systems, thinking about reuse practices, how you can extract maybe some products from a building that's falling down to use them in another space, right? There's a lot of this going on. I would say a bit still marginal, but it kind of depends on where you are, right? I mean, certainly in the Benelux region, the kind of reuse principle is everywhere. France is doing a lot of amazing stuff, not only at the architectural level, but at the policy level about encouraging these sorts of non-demolition policies, right? So it's a question, on the one hand, from the architect, but also, dare I say, from the client, right? In terms of sometimes accepting the complications of cost mechanisms, right? It's harder to kind of map out the energy costs of some of these passive systems. You don't always see them, given the types of economic models that are often used relative to buildings. It's often very hard to see the savings of passive technologies, by which I mean technologies that don't require heavy mechanical systems, right? So there's a lot to do, not only within the architecture field, but in the field of economics, certainly relative to development, and of course policy as well. Thanks for your question.
Is there a last question? I don't think so. So let me just close this by thanking you, Daniel.
Thank you for your time.
And also let me remind you, for those who don't know about it, there is an interesting European initiative. Maybe, Daniel, you can say a last word about that.
Yeah.
It is called the New European Bauhaus. It is probably, again, something very positive that comes from Europe. The three words and values that defined it are beautiful, sustainable, together. And I don't think it can get any better than that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Pretty straightforward in those three terms. And really, I think one of the amazing things about the NEB, the New European Bauhaus, is this insistence that the sustainable world of the future relative to the built environment will be beautiful, right? And will be resilient, and will be spaces that we want to be in, right? We might have to take our jacket off, right? But that's okay. Yeah. Thanks.